I'll be reading Berry Bush and doing the VENDLER analysis. The winter they abandoned Long Point Village, a dozen two-room houses of pine frames clad, with cedar faded to silver and, not much whiter or larger, the one-room church. They hauled it all down to the docks on sledges, and at high tide boats towed the houses as hulks across the harbor and set them on the streets of Provincetown. Today they're identified by blue tile plaques. Forgotten the fruitless village, in broken holes, transported by a mad Yankee frugality, sweating resolve and pickled the sea-black timbers. The loathsome part of American Zen for me is in the parable of the raft. A traveler hacks it from driftwood tugged from the very current that wedged it into the mud, and lashes it with bitter roots he strips between his teeth. And after the raft has carried him across the torrent in his path, the teacher says,
"The traveler doesn't lift the raft on his back and lug it with him on his journey. Oh no, he leaves it there behind him, doesn't he?"
There must be something spoiled in the translation. Surely those old original warriors and ruling class officials and Shinto saints knew a forgetting heavier than that. The timbers plunged in oblivion, hardened by salt, black, obdurate, pearl-shaped column of ancient king spice. At the raspberry thicket's heart, the immigrant vow not to carry humiliations of the old country to the new, still infusing the segmented sweet berry, illegible ingested seed, scribble of red allegiances raked along your wrist. Under all, the dead thorns sharper than the green. Okay, so we'll be going over the VENDLER checklist, and the first part is meaning. In the first paragraph, it's talking about how the people abandoned Long Point Village, and then they moved, and they even brought their houses and hauled it all the way to Provincetown. I looked this up, and this actually happened around the 1800s, and this is in Cape Cod. So the Long Point Village place, it was really isolated, and before they were pretty prosperous off of salt, but then like New York had a bigger salt supply and stuff like that, so they weren't really doing well, and they had to move, and they actually towed their houses all the way to Provincetown. This was like the west side of the village, and that's the blue tile plaques. That just shows kind of the history of what they've gone through. And then the second part is alluding to an American Zen of a parable of the rafts, talking, kind of referring to how they towed the houses. But in this instant, the teacher says, you shouldn't tow the boat all the way to your new life. Using that raft, you don't have to use it anymore, and you leave it behind and you move on. And then it talks about how people of the old regime who had established statuses wouldn't really take that into account, and how this is what the immigrant is struggling to do, because they're struggling between their past life and their old life and their new life that they're trying to find. And I'm guessing that the speaker is inevitably saying that the past will always be a part of you and will always hold on to you and defines you more than your current situation. And onto Antecedent Scenario, like I was saying, it was talking about how these people, they really tried so hard to move everything that they owned to a new place, to bring their old things to a new place. I'm also guessing that the speaker has some kind of resentment towards this style of thinking, maybe that the speaker fails to acknowledge themselves, and also talking about immigrants and the old and the new, old world, new world, old life, new life. Okay, so division into parts, it's only 2 paragraphs, and yeah, there's a gap between them, and I would have made it more clear, but it would have looked like this, so yeah. And for the climax, I see it in the timbers plunged in oblivion, hardened by salt. That part, it's kind of talking about the conflicts between the past and the present, and I noted that the timbers could be the pillars of the past, because they talked about that in the first paragraph too, and how they fall down to the raspberry bushes, and the raspberry bushes kind of probably represent the prosperity or just the present condition, so basically saying that the past will dictate the present no matter what. And other parts that I see in the first paragraph, it's narrating and observing a village in the real world, and then the second paragraph is more hypothetical and reflects on the parable of the raft, ancient times, and a figurative forest that can be more vague. It's not as clear. And the skeleton, I don't really know how to draw a perfect skeleton, but at first it's pretty peaceful. I mean, there are some kind of aggressive words, but it wasn't that bad. And then it leads all the way to the timbers plunged in oblivion, and then the next line, that was really hard to read, so it's really showing the violent conflict between the two and how difficult it is to reconcile the two. And then they kind of conclude with, no matter what, the dead thorns are sharper than the green. Okay, so language, I highlighted a lot of the verbs that the speaker uses, like abandoned, hauled, mad, hacks, and then some adjectives like bitter. There's a lot of aggressive, rough verbs. Maybe it's showing the harshness of reality or how aggressively the past plays a role in our lives. And yeah. Okay, so the tone, once again, I highlighted a lot of this stuff. Like mad Yankee frugality and forgotten the fruitless village. It's kind of as if the speaker is mocking or speaking with scorn, like making fun of how these villagers are living their lives and their decisions like this. And then the speaker moves on to the loathsome part, so they kind of input their own thoughts or emotions towards what they're describing. And when he quotes the teacher has this tone of like, isn't that obvious? Like, that's just what makes sense. So he's trying to make sense of everything. Roads not taken. In the beginning, all it said was winter. It didn't really refer to any other season. So they could have talked about spring, how even though there's winter, like even though the past may dictate the way you think good things could inevitably happen and you could grow out of that. It didn't really talk about that. It didn't talk about the spring or the harvest, like in the fall. It only talked about the winter. It was more of a pessimistic tone, and it could have been more direct. But in the second paragraph, it was kind of confusing at first because they talked about like American Zen and all these references that weren't super direct, and they used confusing comparisons and analogies and with metaphors like the raspberry thicket. And that's up to the audience to interpret. They didn't include specific time or dates, which probably suggests that these issues happen regardless of what time period we live in. The genres, I think the first one would be a narration because the speaker is simply providing like a background to the story, and I think it would be poetry, but it's also prose because there's no rhyming or any rhythm to it at all. It's just lines, and it could be satire. Maybe they're revealing something about society that is what keeps us down or is what defines us in a dark way. And for imagination, there's a lot I have here. There's a lot of imagery with fruit, and fruit has to do with seasons and ripeness and prosperity. And the title is Berry Bush, and then at the end, they're talking about the raspberry thicket's heart. The sweet berry probably meaning the potential or future success that you could have. In the first paragraph, they're saying forgotten the fruitless village. So maybe that has to do with the past, which is Long Point Village, is not fruitless. So the present or the future is the fruit. And then a lot of colors are used with, in the beginning, cedar faded to silver, not much whiter, blue, black, red, green. I searched up blue tile plaques, and that has to do with the villagers that moved to Provincetown. In the end, only 2 houses were left there during the Civil War, and there were about 200 villagers living there in the beginning. But the blue tile plaques shows like their history, like where they came from. It adds credibility, authenticates a history. So it's talking about like past and present again. Those blue tile plaques represents the past. And there are a lot of oxymorons too, showing some irony or like maybe a satire, I guess, like broken holes and new of forgetting. And yeah. Another thing I wanted to point out was at the end when the speaker mentions dead thorns sharper than the green, which I'm guessing the past is the dead thorns and the present is like the green, the new, what's to come. Anything that's colorful is what's to come, and anything that's in the past is black or dead or gray. And it's saying how it pierces sharper, or it's sharper than the green. So the past defines you more definitely than your present circumstances, and more clearly because you already know what happened in the past, but you don't know how the present is going to play a role in who you are. And yeah, that's about it.